So I'll try that again. Hello and welcome to this series of discussions from a radical feminist perspective. Today I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Professor Sheila Jeffreys. And hello, Sheila.
Hello, Jo. Delighted to be with you as well.
And I don't think you really need any introduction, but Sheila was active in the women's liberation movement of the 70s and 80s when she became a lesbian, and she taught political science taught in the political science department of the University of Melbourne for 25 years. I hope that's accurate. And she's now back in the UK, I'm pleased to say. And I think Sheila's work is both provocative and accessible. And to my mind, Sheila was one of the most prolific and intellectually lively feminist thinkers. She's been writing feminine texts since 1985, and her work over the last decade include Man's Dominion, Gender Hurts, and most recently her autobiography, Trigger Warning. I'm particularly pleased to be discussing or asking Sheila questions, more to the point, Man's Dominion, because I think it's one of my favourite of Sheila's works, and it does get rather overlooked. So, so Sheila, may I ask, why did you write the book? What was your inspiration?
Yes, well, first of all, it's just lovely to be here and able to talk about this book with feminists. And could I say, I usually say ovarial rather than seminal. If I want to talk about my work, ovarial, I hope.
I went with seminal, but I don't know if that was picked up.
Sorry?
I went with seminal.
Oh, feminal. Yeah, actually, I quite like feminal too. Okay. So yes, Man's Dominion. I wrote the book and it was published in 2011 because I was becoming very worried about the way that it was becoming harder and harder to talk about the oppression of women because of a newfound respect, apparently, for religion that was happening at that time. I was on a feminist email list in Australia, and I wanted to be critical. I was critical of the veil, the covering of women as a harmful cultural practice. And women would be talking about how you had to respect culture. And of course, they talked about women's choice and so on and so on. And they said that you needed to respect religion, difference, and there were even accusations of racism for being critical of the veil. So I was very aware, because I was a feminist of long standing and also an atheist since I was 12, that the rejection of religion was absolutely fundamental to the women's liberation movement. The idea that any kind of religion or its woman-hating practices should be respected was very horrifying to me. So I had to write a book to find out why religion had come back and how it was destroying women's human rights. The book examines the ways in which the ideology and practice of the three monotheistic religions that came out of the same cultural crucible in the Middle East create and maintain the oppression of women. The three religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, have extremely similar attitudes to women, and I sought to show this in the book. They are culturally very similar. Consider hair, for instance. In Fundo Judaism, women must shave their heads and wear wigs. In Christianity, women had to cover their heads on entering the church to show obedience. I don't know if they still have to do this in some places. I suspect they do. In Fundo Islam, women have to cover their hair or all body parts, including hands. This is because women's hair and bodies are seen as too exciting for men, supposedly. And women may have to be excluded from public space in these religions. For instance, Mount Athos in Greece is a Greek Orthodox church peninsula, which has historically excluded all women. Imagine, men must have had to do their own housework. And Prince Charles from the UK visited several times in the 1980s when he was getting involved in Orthodox religion. He wanted to enjoy the men-only atmosphere there. And I remember that in the 1980s, when the sort of head priest from Mount Athos visited Britain, at Heathrow Airport, all women had to be cleared. The cleaners were mainly women at that time, of course. All women had to be cleared from the corridors he had to walk through so that he did not have to see women. So you see, the religions are very, very similar. And you can see why I did look at them together.
Thank you. And the book also sort of looks at the difference between faith and culture and explores multiculturalism. I always had this sort of lazy idea that multiculturalism was a good thing, and it never really occurred to me whose culture was really being defended or sort of, you know, being sort of made room for. Could you perhaps sort of explain a little bit about what to you multiculturalism is and why you think it is harmful to women?
Yeah, the book has a chapter on multiculturalism. And the idea of multiculturalism was being used when I wrote the book as a way to prevent feminist criticism of harmful cultural practices against women, such as the veil, arranged or forced marriages, female genital mutilation, the seclusion of women. These were all being defended on the grounds that there should be respect for other cultures, which is this fundamental principle of multiculturalism. I explain in the book that the multiculturalism that's exemplified, particularly in the political systems of Canada and Australia, is a form in which the minority groups are governed. The male governments delegate the job of controlling their communities to male citizens, usually imams, rabbis, priests, from cultural and religious minorities to run their communities. And of course, they hope for their votes. And the imams, the priests, the rabbis are given authority over women. It's similar to the system by which the British governed West Africa in the early 20th century. In East Africa, the British colonists just went in, they stole the land, and they ruled the population by direct force. In West Africa, the colonial authorities delegated their power to tribal leaders who governed their tribes on behalf of the British. Multiculturalism is the West African system. Multiculturalism creates enclaves, a system of what is called enclavism, in which minority communities are expected to control themselves mainly through religious leaders, with the agreement that they will not be interfered with by the state. Enclavism has many problems associated with it, including the fact that boy children raised within it may be segregated from dominant culture in ways which could encourage fundamentalism and men's violence, and girls may be subjected to medieval forms of abuse and control.
Thank you. And your other books, quite often you seem to be sort of ahead of the tide, but, you know, really hitting a wave in terms of gender hurts, sort of just sort of preempted the rise of concern about transgenderism and similarly anti-climax. So why do you think this book has been ignored? Because it hasn't received the attention that others have.
No, it hasn't. If I could just follow up on the last question for a moment, though, and say a little bit more about culture. Multiculturalism is, as a student of mine once said, should really be called multi-patriarchy, because all cultures, of course, are based fundamentally on the oppression of women. That is what culture is about. Culture's created from that. Marriage patterns and patterns of child rearing and owning and so on and so on. It may be possible to find some elements of culture that aren't based upon the oppression of women. There may be some kinds of food, for instance, that aren't necessarily to do with the oppression of women. But the way the food is cooked, who does it, will be based on the oppression of women. For instance, Italian chefs make profits from restaurants with the recipes of their grandmothers, but they are men. So it's very difficult to find any elements of what's called culture that doesn't come from the oppression of women. So since that is the case, for instance, in Western culture, I want to get rid of gender, I want to abolish marriage, I want to get rid of the harmful cultural practices on women of having to bare their depilated bodies and wear high-heeled shoes and so on. So culture needs to be completely abolished. All male cultures need to be abolished, then rebuilt from the way up, from what is good for women. And that would be, I mean, none of the cultures existing at the moment are anything but totally patriarchal. So we need to get rid of them all. So multiculturalism in that sense needs to be understood as multi-patriarchy. So multiculturalism requires us to respect dominant male cultures and accept their values, which I cannot do. Okay, I just needed to get that in. No. But now I'm happy to talk about the what you asked, which is what happened to the books that I've published. I know why are some of them popular at a certain time and others aren't. Well, the Anticlimax, for instance, which I published in 1990, was had more of an impact at the time, I think, because it came out of a powerful women's movement. There was generally huge criticism from feminists of the construction of sexuality and of heterosexuality as a political institution at that time. So the book fitted into that. It was understood, it was much appreciated, which was terrific. I don't think it would be understood now because all of that critique has gone. Then Gender Hurts was published in 2014, but in fact, I submitted that to a publisher who was not interested in 2007. And I'm very pleased that a publisher was not interested in 2007 because that would have been too early. Feminists did not see the politics of transgenderism as a threat then. But by 2014, quite a lot of feminists were beginning to see that. And therefore, the book hit that magic golden spot. And it was good that it was published at that time. Man's Dominion, when it was published in 2012, well, I guess that many feminists didn't think religion was important. It was absolutely not picked up. Nobody was interested in it. And I do think that's because feminists thought, oh, religion, we've dealt with that. And most feminists were atheists and they thought it wasn't important. So they were not interested in a book which showed the serious threats to women, not only in enclaves within Western culture, but also internationally at the UN and so on. That wasn't seen as interesting. It was a great shame because I put a lot of energy into the book. I really liked the book. You know, having been an atheist since I was 12, it was an important book for me, a feminist atheist womanifesto, but there was really no interest in it.
And sort of on that vein, I know there's it does feel like it's become a taboo topic, kind of ironically. Have you had much kickback from feminists for writing it?
Absolutely none, because absolutely nobody has commented on it whatsoever in any way.
That's a good thing, I guess.
The book just disappeared into the ether.
Right. Yeah,
most women do not know that I wrote such a book, and they wouldn't be interested if they did because they don't think it's an interesting topic.
How funny. I mean, I asked on Twitter. I sort of did a bit of crowdsourcing for you know what questions people might want to ask you, and not one of them. I said I was discussing this book. Not one of them referenced the book. Nope. which yeah, I did think was interesting, kind of telling. But how do you think? I mean, obviously there are women apostates from Islam in particular speaking out. How can we amplify their voices? How can we work with them? You know, how can we sort of support the existing movement against religion?
Well, I do think I'm enormously admiring of women who are brave enough to speak out, because it is very dangerous to do so, and potentially dangerous in some situations to their lives. So it's very important that feminists support them in whatever ways they can. But it's not always easy to do. I did think that my book could be helpful. I hope that it would be. And I have a chapter looking at the women who were and still are the same women challenging fundamentalism at that time. And I do think that some of the women in Britain who do challenge fundamentalism very bravely read the book. I've seen little indications that they may have. I'm sure they would have. But of course, they never mentioned it. And they certainly never wanted to work with me. And I think that is because I'm seen as too radical feminist and too dangerous to their interests. It's dangerous enough to be an apostate and try to work against fundamentalism without having any kind of attachment to somebody who's seen as this, you know, crazy radical feminist as well. So I suspect that's why the book was not really taken up. I was a little bit disappointed. I wanted to go and speak at, you know, feminist atheist conferences and so on. I never got the opportunity to do that, and that was disappointing.
Yes. So sorry, I have a disclosure. So, I mean, something that's so obviously Ayan Hirsi Ali has recently written a book, Pray, which has sort of been quite sort of, well, I think revolutionary in terms of what she's exposed, and predictably the only people that seem to be sort of giving her a platform are on the right. Mm-hmm. And how do you think we can uncouple criticism of religion from racism?
That's an interesting question. I've just noticed that Maryam Namazi, I cover in the book where I look at apostates, women who are challenging fundamentalism. I look at Maryam Namazi and Ayaan Hirsi Ali and others. And Maryam Namazi, I noticed, has written a review in the Standard of Hirsi Ali's book Pray, in which she says she's extremely right-wing, she absolutely hates the book, she says that the figures are wrong, and so on and so on and so on. Now, what the book says is that there needs to be some consideration of the way in which immigration of men, particularly men on their own in large numbers, from countries where women are seen as extremely inferior. And for instance, if they're seen on the streets without men to protect them or uncovered, they are seen as prey. She wants to look at how the immigration of these men could create a problem in Europe for traditional women's rights. For instance, she looks at the situation where in some areas of some cities in Europe, you will not see women on the street. You will see men sitting outside cafes, men will be the waiting staff in those cafes. If any woman walks through that area, she's likely to be harassed, and it's seen as completely reasonable to harass her because she shouldn't be there, and if she is, then she's asking for it in a sense. Now, I mean, others have written and done little films about this before. One woman did a film walking through Brussels showing the way she was treated by men as she tried to walk down the street. And I think it's been done in America as well. So it's certainly the case that there are areas of cities which have become no-go areas for women to be in. So that's an interesting question. It's an interesting question what we do about it, because, you know, if women's rights are taken seriously, there should not be any areas of any cities which are woman-free in that sense. And she also looks at the issue of women being raped. I mean, she starts off by covering the 2011 rapes that took place in Tahrir Square in Egypt. Amongst the crowds of protesters, many women were raped, and what men did was to circle around them like wolves in concentric circles, bear down upon them, tear their clothes off and rape them. And a Western journalist had this happen to her. And she then explains that there's a name for this practice in North Africa, and it's a way of punishing women who are seen as out of place and doing things they shouldn't do. She then looks at the New Year's Eve rapes that happened in Cologne a couple of years ago, where exactly the same things happened. I think 47 women were raped, and the same thing happened. The men were surrounding them as if they were prey indeed, and raping and assaulting women. And she says this was organized on social media. The men organized the rapes. And she gives many more examples of situations that she thinks have some relation to woman-hating cultures that these men might come from. Now, Maryam Namazi says in her review that Hirsi Ali wants to criminalize immigration, but she doesn't do that, because she says she herself is an immigrant. She's a refugee, in fact. She says what she wants to do is start a conversation about how these men can be integrated into a culture which has more respect for women's rights. How to do that, she sees as the crucial problem. It's true, she absolutely doesn't give enough attention to how we do that, but that's what she calls for. So I think it's a very interesting book, but she's got great difficulty getting it taken seriously, it's fair to say.
I remember vehemently arguing that there was absolutely no relation to culture when the rapes happened on New Year's Eve, and now reflecting back, yeah, I feel like it was a kind of a massive blind spot. But I was just so concerned about racism and about sort of making things worse for immigrants that I kind of ignored what was patently obvious, really. I feel kind of a bit embarrassed about that now. So what was I going to ask? So do you think sort of more widely then perhaps multiculturalism has had a role in obscuring some of the crimes of men, particularly sort of with regards to grooming, with regards to the attacks in Cologne and other places? Do you think that's do you think it's sort of obscured male violence in that sense?
Well, I didn't in the book talk about male violence in that way, but I think it certainly helps to obscure other forms of male violence towards women. For instance, I consider it a form of male violence towards women that young girls in Britain are forced into marriages at very young ages, often polygamous marriages, often marriages that are not registered with the state, so there's no record of it. And this is not considered to be a big problem. Of course, it is a big problem if a girl is put into a marriage, and of course she can be pretty much any age because it's not official and it's not, registered with the state, and then finds herself in a polygamous situation, and she's then having forced pregnancies that she doesn't want, and then the man decides to leave or whatever, and she has no means of support. There is no protection, and this is happening in Britain. There's been quite a lot of research to show that it is happening, but it's not considered to be an important problem because this is a problem, it's an enclave problem, it's not a problem that should bother the state. So there are many practices of this kind of violence against women and girls that are not considered to be significant.
Do you think the concept of the gentleman's agreement, which you sort of explore and you just sort of reference there in a way, can be applied to other areas where faith-based beliefs have been allowed to take precedence over women's rights?
Yes, now in the book, I use the concept of the gentleman's agreement, which really comes from Carol Pateman's work. And Carol Pateman explains that her concept of the sexual contract is that governing men make a contract which is in the form of a gentleman's agreement with the men they govern. The men they govern are given control over women. And the agreement is they will then respect the government of the state. They have the women for their use in marriage, and they will respect the government of the state. So I use this concept, which I think is a very useful one, to explain what happens in multiculturalism, which is that governments of countries like the UK, for instance, seem to make a gentleman's agreement with those men who make themselves the self-styled representatives, because they're not elected, of particular cultural or religious groups. And the gentleman's agreement is, we won't interfere with you as long as you carry on sort of ruling your little communities and vote for us. Right? So there's a gentleman's agreement going on. And what I find really interesting about it is, in international relations terms, there's a pretty well-known concept now, which is humanitarian intervention. The idea of humanitarian intervention is that if the situation of civilian populations in a country like in a war zone is particularly grievous, then it is reasonable for other countries to get involved to try and protect that civilian population. Well, women and girl children are the civilian population in some enclaves in Britain, but the government would certainly not choose to intervene. For instance, you're probably aware that female genital mutilation is a practice which is illegal in this country since 2003, but there's never really any cases. I think there's been something like one. So the girl children are not protected in that way. So there is no concentration, there's no interest in looking after the interests of women who belong to different groups of men. I think that's the way that it is looked at.
And there's a section in the book about education and about the role of schools in basically providing a sort of, I guess, options that might not be available for children at home who have been sort of indoctrinated into religious belief. How do you feel about homeschooling now? Because thanks to obviously the march of gender ideology, a lot of schools push really patriarchal and unpleasant views with regard to pornography and transgenderism on children. And I think in response, some feminists seem to be sort of pulling their children out of school. How do you feel about that?
Yes, well, what has happened in Britain, and it was happening in Australia, and doubtless Canada and other countries too, in the first decade of the 20th century, is that the states were handing over, because of course they wanted smaller states, they were neoliberals, they thought the state shouldn't have responsibility for all sorts of things. So they handed over control of schools, many public services, to religious organizations, which was a very, very serious problem for women and children. For instance, in Australia and in this country too, I think, women's refuges were handed over to the Salvation Army. Well, the Salvation Army is not a feminist organization. It knows absolutely nothing whatsoever about violence against women, and certainly doesn't have a feminist understanding of what that is. So you have a situation where services built up by feminists over decades, which with a particular and extraordinary expertise and care for women, is just handed over to some organization that belongs to a religion that has never been favorable to women whatsoever. So that's an example of what's been going on. And of course, that was done with schools as well. Tony Blair in this country was responsible for religionizing education. It had always been the situation that religious schools were funded by the state. Money from the state was given to these schools. But Tony Blair really upped the ante on this, and he said that schools of all religions should be created, or state schools should be turned into religious schools, and these schools should be supported with money from the state. It was a campaign, and it's been hugely effective. So, even the little primary school near me where I go to vote has crucifixes in the corridor. Now, this is supported by the state, and children have to see crucifixes, this horrible, sadomasochistic, violent practice portrayed on their walls to children. I mean, why would you be cruel to children like that? But that's what has happened. Of course, I think that religion should be removed from all schools altogether, but in fact, it's absolutely dominant now within many sectors of education. So what's happened as a result of this is that schools are promoting their religious ideologies. There are Muslim schools, for instance, in which girls and boys are segregated, and in which girls are expected to be covered. Imagine that, it's children being covered. Where girls are, and indeed boys, are not supposed to be listening to music or dancing, where girls cannot take part in sport. It's very difficult when you're completely covered, certain forms of science, certain forms of art that might show naked bodies, and so on and so on. All of these things must be kept away. And the instructions to girls in many of the textbooks that have been found in these schools are extraordinarily patriarchal, all about obeying men, and so on and so on. Fortunately, there is some control over this, which is that Ofsted, the body which oversees schools, has some responsibility, and they sometimes go into these schools and say you cannot segregate girls and boys, and so on and so on. Actually, I believe there shouldn't be mixed schools, so I think that schools should only go to girls' schools, because boys are now too toxic as a result of pornography and so on to be in schools with girls at this time. So the Ofsted offers some kind of control. Now, I do understand that some women, it's a surprise to me. I came back in 2015, I had no idea that all this homeschooling stuff was going on. But from writing Man's Dominion, I was very well aware there was a big homeschooling movement in the US, and there was a homeschooling movement in Australia too. The homeschooling movement in the US is completely dominated by evangelicals, and they homeschool their children so they don't have to have any contact with the outside society. So the girls are completely trapped. And in the schools, of course, well, in the homeschooling rather, because they're doing homeschooling, the girls are taught, in the Southern Baptists teach girls that they must call their husband Lord. Yes, I'm absolutely serious about that. And it's a kind of extraordinary situation. And the girls are taught things like how to take the shoes of their fathers off when they come home from the office or whatever it is, and so on. Extraordinary situation. Now, this is all happening through homeschooling. So it seemed to me on reading that book that homeschooling was, yes, very, 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 very problematic indeed. But at least in Australia, there was some control over it. There was a register of who was homeschooling. Homeschooling was necessary because of desert areas and so on, and people were in the outback. But there was a controlled curriculum online. There was a register. I came back to this country and discovered there was absolutely no register, although there's now a call for one. Anybody can just keep their kids off the school. They don't have to have any skills or talents. They could be religious fundamentalists who wanted to prevent girls from actually meeting the world. They could be families where men are violent towards children and therefore they want to keep them back so that the bruises are not seen. And there's no control. And it's completely extraordinary to me because though the state is not necessarily benign, and of course, in many ways it isn't because at the moment it's pushing into schools terrible transgender ideology, which is very, very harmful to children. Nonetheless, Ofsted, for instance, offers some kind of control over the sorts of indoctrination and practices that are enforced upon children. So I'm very surprised that there is a movement amongst women. And it can only be women who can afford to not work, of course. So it's very limited in its scope, to say that these children are mine, they don't belong to the state, I'm going to be able to educate them at home. It worries me a great deal. The state is, of course, not ideal, but I think home is much less ideal.
Thank you. And something I've seen come up as an argument quite a lot recently, is there are some feminists who seem to feel that the best way to push against gender ideology, the way that stands the most chance of succeeding, is to use religious belief. So, for example, sort of, looking at the sort of religious prohibitions around the mixing of men and women, and sort of using that as a way to push forward the idea that, we do indeed need sex segregated spaces. What do you think about that?
I think that the important thing is to say that all women have to have sex segregated spaces in order for our privacy, our dignity and our safety. I do think that putting forward a religious argument is problematic, but it is a good way, I think, to show the extraordinary hypocrisy of those who pay lip service to something called multiculturalism, this problematic thing called multiculturalism, and they say that they respect religion and culture, and they abandon it the moment men say, I want to get into the women's toilet so that I can have an erection and wave my dick about. I mean, it's an extraordinary situation, and I think it's good only because it shows that extraordinary hypocrisy.
Okay, thank you. And there's sort of something else I was wondering about, is I can't help thinking that in many respects, the sort of, for want of a better phrase, the woke ideology that we're seeing at the moment in terms of queer theory being normalized, transgenderism being normalized, and sort of offense being weaponized, and is in a way like a religion. Were you to write the book again today, would you include it?
No, I definitely would not. I don't think wokeism is a religion. It's a political philosophy, if you like. But yes, it has, like, anti-evolutionism and the idea that the world was flat and so on was very important. And the idea that people were descended from monkeys was seen as absolutely crazy. In the 1920s in America, evolution theory was not allowed to be taught in some states, in southern states of the USA, and that was political. I don't know that it was exactly religious, but it was certainly political. I do not think that wokeism, which is very similar because it's anti-science and it makes similarly absurd arguments, I don't think it's a religion because the definitions of religion that I work with in the book are about having certain symbols and things that you worship and so on and so on. It doesn't fit into those things. So I wouldn't include wokeism. I'm very happy to write about wokeism in other places and in other ways. And I think that it does have cult-like aspects, but not exactly a religious cult. It's something a little bit different, I think.
Thank you. I was curious. So I was also wanted to know what you thought about intersectionality, whether you feel that has been, in general, something useful in terms of perhaps making us all a bit more considered, or whether you think perhaps it's been weaponized to shut up what might be valid criticisms of religion.
Well, I think that there's a lot of confusion about what intersectionality is. As I understand it, it's very similar to the ideas back in the 1970s of feminists, which is that all the different ways in which women are oppressed need to be understood together. So it needs to be understood that a woman may be oppressed by race and class as well as simply sex, and that these things are so enmeshed together that it's very, very difficult to separate them. And there are ways in which feminists must approach this and fight it. For instance, in relation to prostitution and pornography, Black women are particularly vulnerable to being involved. For instance, Black and Indigenous women are hugely involved in prostitution industries in Canada, in Australia, in America, because of their poverty and their vulnerable status. Black women are used in pornography in horrendous ways, in which racist disgust at them by white men is eroticized, and so on. So it needs to be understood that these issues go together and they cannot be separated. But what's happening now with intersectionality is that it seems to be the argument that it is wrong for feminists to concentrate on issues that affect both Black and white women, because that is naughty and it's selfish, and women are always selfish. And actually, women should always be fighting all issues at the same time, which is race, class, disability, and so on, and probably ignore what happens to women because men are not affected by that. And only issues that affect men are really, really important. So that there's this huge attempt to get women to feel guilty if they concentrate on women at all. And of course, intersectionality apparently includes any men who, for sexual excitement purposes, pretend to be women. So it includes men who transgender, and so on and so on. So intersectionality has a very, very different meaning now from what I think it had originally when it was developed by Kimberly Crenshaw, and from ideas in the 1970s about how sex, race, and class intertwined in the experience of women. And yes, it is used as a weapon to beat feminists with. And men's organizations never have to do everything at the same time. I mean, you know, men's socialist organizations, trade unions, and so on, they don't have to fight everything at the same time. In fact, they ignore what's happening to women most of the time and have no interest in it whatsoever. So it's a stick that is used to beat those selfish women who actually want to look at what happens to women.
Thank you. I'm sort of inclined to agree, to be honest. Something else that I'm aware of that I don't, maybe you do touch on in the book. I'm terribly sorry, I suddenly can't remember. Why do you think more women profess religious beliefs than men?
Yes, now this is an interesting question, because in countries where the Christian religion is coming back in huge force, for instance, in South America, it is mostly women who are going to the churches, and the priests are mostly men, and women are the majority of the population. I don't know what the figures are for the UK, but I imagine the figures are huge for women in terms of the populations of the churches. So that's staggering to try and keep going here. So why is that the case? Well, Andrea Dworkin's wonderful book, Right-Wing Women, is very interesting about all of this. And she explains that the situation of women makes them very vulnerable. They are not usually economically independent. They have children and need to protect children. Generally, the situation for women, particularly if we think of men's violence in general, makes women put them in a precarious situation. So women have a tendency to move towards that which, whatever they see will give them more security. And so for many women who go towards the right wing in the States, she argues that this is because they seek that security. And I think that makes sense in terms of religion generally, is that women will seek safety. and they will seek safety, and they will seek comfort too, some solace. If your life is absolutely wretched because you're being beaten by a man, suffering from poverty, trying to bring up several children, and so on, the idea that you can go and get some comfort in a church, you can pray, do that kind of stuff, can be important, even though, of course, what women are doing is going precisely into the belly of the beast, because it is that religion that I would argue is the foundation of the system that oppresses them in the first place. But I can see why women would try to make that into a virtue and try to get something out of religion, even though it's the very basis of their oppression.
Thank you. Something you mentioned earlier about multiculturalism and the fact that in effect it supports a neoliberal idea because you delegate, if you like, the structures of state to patriarchs. Why do you think the left have embraced it, given how racist it is, in that obviously it has a different set of human rights, at a different sort of level of human rights, and secondly, how sexist it is? Why do you think it's become such a sort of sacred cow of the left?
You're absolutely right. Multiculturalism says some women do not have the same human rights as other women and cannot be considered and protected in the same way. In terms of the left, well, of course, the left is entirely male dominated and always has been, and in ways that have been very, very shocking. If you think of the whole history of the trade union movement and the terrible way that women were treated and kept out for such a long time. I mean, it's slightly different now because, unionism needs women. It's in such threat, but still, it's very, very hostile to women's interests. So I'm not surprised in that sense that they would not consider women's rights when considering respect for multiculturalism. It's an interesting question to me because, I mean, in the book, I talk about situations like where Ken Livingstone, who was mayor of London and seen as very much on the left, he invited to London to give a talk some imam from the Middle East who had ideas like gays should be thrown from hilltops and so on. I mean, enormously hostile to homosexuality and to women. And when he spoke in London, lesbians and gay men and feminists were protesting and picketing outside because this man was so terrible. But Ken Livingstone invited him in with absolutely no quibbling whatsoever about the views towards homosexuality and women. I do not completely understand it. I can't give you a complete explanation for this. I know one of the reasons is that the left has always thought that it had the migrant vote in the bag, right? So, and that was an important part of the constituency that would vote for the left. And in fact, when Women Against Fundamentalism was started back in the early 1980s, they talked about how if they were going on marches, left marches, nobody wanted them. The ethnic minority communities were represented by men, and they certainly didn't want Women Against Fundamentalism anywhere near them. It was embarrassing to the lefties who were organizing the march that Women Against Fundamentalism were there. They had to try and find a space at the back to get in because they were embarrassing to the parliamentary interests and the political interests of the left. And I think that's very illustrative of the problem, but really it's mind-blowingly difficult to understand. There's extraordinary betrayal of women and women's rights in this way.
Thank you. I mean, that's interesting examples you give. One of my first I first dipped my toe into politics in my early 20s, and I used to go to well, before then actually, but I used to go to a lot of Stop the War marches, and I remember hearing Mozambique speak, and various other sort of characters who frankly would have gladly taken my rights away, and because it seemed like it was a fight against imperialism and it was a fight against sort of a Western waged war, it sort of obscured the reality, it obscured the truth, it made it really difficult to unpick. So yeah, thank you.
Yes, and I think back at, in the late 1970s, when Michel Foucault was lauding the revolutionaries in Iran that were about to bring in an extraordinarily horrific regime upon women, I think that a lot of men on the left saw these fundamentalists as somehow, well, we know they did from the way they wrote about them, as men unleashed. They were the heroes. They were the revolutionary heroes, because, of course, yes, they were anti-colonial, as you say, and that endeared them to the left. And they saw them as these muscular heroes. There was no consideration at all for the situation of women. And I don't think a lot has changed on that front.
No, I don't either. So, I mean, I guess that brings me to the question: where do we go from here? In terms of, when you've got the growth of the far right, sort of, how do we get our arguments out, critiquing religion, critiquing sort of harmful cultural practices that that religion enables to happen to women? How do we sort of critique that without, I guess, adding fuel to the far right?
Well, first of all, it'd be nice if these ideas could have some publicity. It'd be nice if my book had ever been noticed, which it wasn't, and I think it's too late now. And it would be good if it was even possible to speak about these things. And we see what happens to brave women in this country who want to talk about the fact, for instance, that there is child grooming and child abuse by Asian men in this country in a degree that's disproportionate to their population in the population, I think it's fair to say. Sarah Challoner and others, for instance, they are not permitted to speak. And I don't know how we can do anything about the left. I mean, as you know, the left is desperately terrible on transgenderism and the clash with women's rights as well. So it's very difficult to know where to go on that. I wish I could tell you. I do know that I'm probably persona non grata in so many circles that I can't be terribly useful, even though I'm prepared to speak out and talk about these things. So I'm probably not the best person to be asking here in relation to this, I think it's fair to say. And, I did the book in 2012. I actually thought that I might come back to this country and become involved in the creation of a feminist atheist community, because I know lots of feminists are atheists. They never talk about it. And I wanted there to be a feminist atheist community as a rival to the men's atheist community, the Richard Dawkins and so on. Because my understanding of that kind of men's muscular atheism is that it's because they actually think religion is silly, they're rationalists, and it's against their masculine pride that anybody should believe in such silly things. And therefore it's a part of their masculinity to fight it. They have absolutely no interest in women or women's rights. And of course, at their conferences, somebody like me would never get invited to speak. So it's a form of masculinity. I think that kind of atheism. I mean, I am an atheist, and I fight religion because I understand it to be the foundation of the oppression of women. And that's really, really different. And it would be nice to have a community in which a feminist atheism and my feminist atheist manifesto could be a part, could actually exist. I don't know how we create that. At the moment, everybody is very scattered, and Muslim apostates are having to fight religion in their corner. And then I think that there may be women trying to fight religious schools, but I'm not even sure that that's the case. So these things need to come together across the board. And at the moment, that really, really isn't the case.
Thank you. No, I am also an atheist, and that a very childishly termed men's approach, sort of great, clear thinking atheist men. I've termed them objective, which I'm rather proud of. So I just wanted to get that out there. So there are women in Iran at the moment engaged in the White Wednesdays protests, and there's the My Stealthy Freedom is a sort of ongoing campaign against the hijab. what do you think? Do you think feminists are doing enough or do you think we're sort of so distracted looking at fighting pornography, fighting transgenderism, fighting all these attacks? Like, do you feel like we should be doing more? What do you think we can do?
I certainly think we should be doing more. I'm horrified, as I say, by the general impact of religion on women and women's rights. And when I wrote the book, and I think I did say in there that the practices of these three Abrahamic religions, as they're called, are spreading and becoming very severe in many ways. For instance, when I was writing the book, I think I put in that in Jerusalem there were several hundred women who were wearing the burqa, who were Jewish women, but agreed with this idea that women should be entirely covered. There was a street in an area of London that's a mainly ultra-Orthodox Jewish area, where there were posters put on the lampposts saying that women should walk on one side and men should walk on the other. And that is, as I explain in the book, common in Brooklyn, where there are posters telling women how they should behave in the street. And in Brooklyn, women are told that they have to be very careful not to arouse men in the street if they're in those ultra-Orthodox communities, and they have to cross the road if men are walking on those streets, and so on. So there's no question that the imposition of these very woman-hating kinds of religion are spreading out and affecting women in ordinary areas and in ordinary cities where they live. And I would like there to be a general and common campaign against them. But yes, as I say, there's not a general feminist atheist campaign right now.
I was wondering if you might want to give a plug to anything that you're writing at the moment, because I understand you're working on, or you're not at the stage where you can give that a plug.
No, I can. My next book is called Penile Imperialism, The Male Sex Right and Women's Subordination. And unfortunately, it probably won't come out until spring next year. It's in with the publisher and it's in the process of going through the stages. And that book is looking at the way in which, from the sexual revolution onwards, men's sexual fetishes and sexual interests formed the basis of sexual freedom movements, which transformed the law and made huge clashes with women's rights and so on. And the first one of those I look at is paedophilia, which was, of course, very much supported on the left in the 1970s in much the same way that transgenderism, which is another one of these fetishes and another one of these sexual freedom movements, is supported now, because the left supports men's sexual rights, prostitution, pornography, paedophilia, it did, transgenderism, it does now. I mean, it's about men's sexual revolution, sexual freedom. So I look at paedophilia and who supported it and how general it was in the 1970s, who's supporting it now. I look at sadomasochism, which of course is a massive sexual freedom movement, very, very organized, and leads to situation. It's transformed the understanding of what sex is, so that we have women and girls subjected now not only to anal intercourse on a massive scale, but also strangulation as ordinary practices, which, you know, when I was growing up, it was impossible to imagine these practices. I mean, people talked about how anal sex happened in France, but wasn't really much happening in the UK, because the French do strange things. So the sadomasochist movement, which started with gay men in San Francisco, has become absolutely massive and had a huge impact upon how women experience sex and relationships with men. And then, of course, I do look at transgenderism and drag and all of the ways in which the imitation of women for sexual excitement or for entertainment or to advertise prostitution and so on affects women's lives. So that's what the book's about. And I wrote the book because I wanted to place transvestism, as I call it in the book, men's cross-dressing for sexual excitement, within the context of the whole feminist understanding of men's sexuality and men's sexual freedom movements. Because too often transvestism is looked at as if it's something something separate from the whole understanding of men's sexual violence, men's sexuality, and so on.
Thank you. I'm conscious that we only have 4 minutes, but at the same time, that actually made me think about something which might be a bigger question than 4 minutes can allow for. But given that the left and sort of libertarianism, if you like, has sort of aligned itself with that, do you think that in a way, sort of the growth of religion is a response to that?
A response to the left, the growth of religion, a response to the left. I had never considered that this would be the case. I see the growth of religion as about the right, about men's control and power over women on the right, rather than being a response to the left. No, I can't say that seems so. Do you think so, Jo? What do you think?
I've seen it framed like that. So I've sort of, I suppose I've been sort of found myself in the weird position of working in parallel with some religious Christians in particular, just over sort of certain issues like pornography. And I can't help thinking that sadly the sort of numbers of feminists are tiny compared to the numbers of religious people on the right. And they certainly seem to see it like that themselves. I think they think they're fighting a holy war, if you like, against cultural Marxism or whatever the hell else they want to frame it as. So I've wondered, yeah, if possibly that sort of search for certainty might be, in their minds, what it's about. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it may be so. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know either. We have 2 minutes. Was there anything else that perhaps you feel that I ought to have covered that I haven't?
I just want to respond to something in the chat. There are women who are responding to, I think, particularly what I was saying about Ayaan Hirsi Ali's book, and suggesting that she might be blaming violence against women on men who come from particularly woman-hating cultures, which of course is absolutely not the case. I write a great deal about violence against women, and in fact there's several chapters in the book I've just written which doesn't mention Islam or any particular cultural backgrounds at all, about men's violence against women. It's just that, which is of course mostly not by men from immigrant backgrounds, because they are a small proportion of men. But what I'm concerned about is that it's so difficult to write about a particular problem, such as the clearing of areas of cities of women, and women who go in those areas, and I do mention this in the book, actually becoming sexually harassed because they're not supposed to be in those areas. I know women are sexually harassed everywhere because men think really if they're in open space, then men have a right to them. That's very general, but there is a particular problem that Ayaan Hirsi Ali addresses, which I think it is worth discussing. And I can see that in the chat at the moment that's being said, well, we mustn't. But actually, I think it's reasonable to do so.
Thanks very much. I think we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you so much for your time, Sheila. I'm sorry, I'm afraid I'm a bit rambly and starstruck.
No, that's fine.
But I really appreciate your time, and indeed for Jo Brew and everyone who's organised this. So thank you all so much.
Yes, thank you, Jo, and thanks to the Joes.
Excellent. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.